On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. By the time the gunman is killed by Austin police, 13 students lay dead, with another 31 wounded. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America. The number of these events continues to rise throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the spring of 1999, the mass shooting of students at Columbine High School becomes the latest notorious milestone. Police set a perimeter and help students escape, but wait for SWAT before entering the building. More students die as a result, prompting changes to how law enforcement respond to what's become known as active shooter incidents. Over the next 17 years, active shooters claim more than 1,500 casualties across the U.S., in towns large and small, in government facilities, schools, places of worship, and most often, places of business. During this time, protocols evolve. Enhanced techniques move first responders to the shooters and victims faster, help manage victim families, witnesses, the media, and evidence collection, all focused on controlling the inevitable chaos. Just after midnight on July 20th, 2012, a lone gunman enters the Century 16 Theater in suburban Aurora, Colorado.
Hello? Help! What do you need help? I'm at the Century 16 Theater, please help! We have police inside of there. Are you injured? Oh my God, there's bodies everywhere, please help! They threw a smoke grenade, and then they started shooting.
Police arrived on the scene 90 seconds after the first 911 call.
Team 6, we got another person outside shot in the leg, a female. I got people running out of the theater that are shot.
Get us some damn gas masks for Theater 9. We can't get in it.
It was quite chaotic. There was a lot of people outside the parking lot. The movie was still playing. The fire alarms were going off. Cell phones were already starting to go off inside the theater.
Is that a suspect? Yes, we got rifles, gas masks. Okay, hold that position, hold your suspect.
Within minutes, the suspect is in custody, and attention turns to the victims.
16, I got 7 down in Theater 9. 16, I need a rescue in here. I have 3 parties shot over here. We've got 2 victims on the east side, north side of the theater. I need an ambulance here quick. Here, where are my ambulances at?
The most that was ever aired on the radio to our fire units was 4 victims. We arrived to people running out of a theater covered in blood.
Oh my God.
We had police officers coming to us asking for help, asking to get this patient out of there, even asking for our breathing apparatus because they wanted to go into the theater where tear gas was being sprayed.
I need officers on the east side to block it.
Incident command to start was me standing on the curb in front of the theater with my radio and a cell phone. The other lieutenant would come and check in with me periodically, and then he would go back into the building to check on stuff. That night, the fire has their channel, we have our channel, so communications is having to relay everything. I did ask for fire command to meet me there. That did not happen for some time.
We need rescue inside the auditorium, multiple victims. We need to start putting them in cars and shuttle them out to that west end. I got a whole bunch of people shot out here, no rescue.
These people were gonna die soon if we didn't do something.
Yes, load them up, get them in cars, get them out of here.
With fire overwhelmed with walking wounded, the police decide to break protocol and self-transport.
It's an extraordinary circumstance. Policy can't cover all of that.
12 people died that night, but the death toll would have been higher without the officers' decision to transport. Of the 70 that were wounded, 17 were critical. 15 of those victims arrived at the hospitals in police cars.
Every person that had survivable injuries on that scene survived.
But the shooter planned for even more victims at his Paris Street apartment.
He had set it up as a booby trap, hoping for first responders to get there, trigger an explosion there, draw the remaining officers to his apartment, and then he could do his acts at the theater. We had a meeting with the bomb teams and the fire leadership and myself. I said, we're not going to let this bastard win. He's not going to get the building. And those guys came back in the morning, and they spent 12 to 14 hours, very slowly, very carefully, taking that apart. All of our training should include that there might be a secondary device. We checked all the cars. It really got us thinking, just how far out do we need to go to check for stuff?
We're going to take questions at the end. Next, we're going to...
What I found on scene is I couldn't even use my cell phone to call the chief or to contact my other PIO because it was just ringing off the hook. And he was, of course, experiencing the same thing. So we got to the point where our cell phones were useless. And early on, I remember asking for spare cell phones that we could use to be able to call command personnel that we needed to speak to. What I realized later is that I could have put on a do not disturb feature, which would have helped immensely that night, because there's no way that we could have fielded all those calls. The thing that helped us the most was using social media. We would put out when we were going to do our interviews, when our first press conference was, and so they had answers. They knew a timeline, when to expect.
With every tragedy, law enforcement must manage the rush of victim families and friends to the scene by establishing a staging area. Here, victim advocates provide critical resources and emotional support. But most importantly, they provide unvarnished information.
There's sort of a myth that you need mental health counselors to rush to a scene to provide support. And the reality is that most people don't need mental health care. They need information. Information is flying so quickly through the media, through Twitter, through all kinds of social media. It presents a real challenge for law enforcement and for families.
It's not unusual for social media to report initial casualty numbers before family members can be notified.
Maybe there are 10 or 15 or 20 casualties, and then all of a sudden you have 10 or 15 or 20 families that are looking for their loved ones. A lot of state medical and local medical examiners have to do a forensic identification.
In some extraordinary situations, however, we have learned that extraordinary measures must be taken to provide support to families.
You can say it looks like there are 20 deceased, there are 20 of you. It looks like your daughter, your son, your husband has been identified preliminarily. You can make a presumptive death notification and then caveat it if you have to. Say this is not certain, it's the best we can do right now, we need your patience. But to just leave families sort of in limbo, hanging there and not knowing, what's going on while the media is getting information. The last thing you want, any of us should want in law enforcement, is for families to get information about the death or injury of a loved one through media.
What I was experiencing was media from around the globe completely overwhelming our city. And I knew it was just a matter of time that those people would find out who these families were, and they were going to completely overwhelm these families.
So Carlson decided to tap her membership in a statewide PIO organization for support.
I have all of my professional PIO organization that's wanting to help. They've been calling me, asking me what I can do. And it was the light bulb went off. I know what they can do. They're going to help these families.
Carlson assigned one volunteer PIO to each family.
These professional PIOs provided a buffer from the media so that these families could grieve.
Lincoln 25, I've got one ambulance here. Where are my ambulances at?
We readily recognize that communication could have been better, which we've since rectified through policy protocol, actually to the extent we reprogrammed our radios to have each other's talk channels on it. Now, when we get dispatched to a scene that we think could be a critical incident, a shooting or something like that, we go to our police channel and we talk to the police commander before we even arrive on scene. And so that's really our first objective now when we're going to a joint response, is to establish unified command from the very beginning.
Even though I have the most respect for the folks that were in the theater that night, and obviously our 12 murder victims, the victimization reaches far beyond that. My wife was a new patrol sergeant. She was working swing shift that night. So her jacket, her hat, her police bag, they were all bloody. We drove home together that morning to the day that I gave that vehicle up. Every time she got into that car, she would look at me and say, "This car smells like blood."
One of our officers, experienced officer, been on a long time, he walked up to me and he goes, "LT, I think I had to carry a little girl out of the theater. I think she's dead." And you could tell he was hurting inside.
You know, I know from working with 9/11, there were people who were in shock for 3 or 4 years. It takes 4 to 8 years for most people just to return to some stabilization after a terrorism event or some other mass casualty.
We have several officers that we've been watching in the organization. We do know that there's some alcoholism involved. We've had some marital problems. Our worst fears are that we'll have some suicidal incidents.
We need to relieve those crews after a traumatic incident. Unfortunately for us, the shooter's apartment happened so quickly after we didn't have time to do that, and it was kind of like an emergency that never ended.
Then the next day, the president decided he wanted to represent the country, come here. So then we ended up with a presidential detail as well.
My chief offers to allow the SWAT team to opt out of that. I said, absolutely not. This is our city. Aurora SWAT will take care of this. As a leader, I'm not sure that was a great decision other than the pride involved.
I think the guys wanted to come back. They felt a need to come back. And they're good officers. They want to come back and do their duty.
A suggestion would be maybe to let these people come back, but not put them in some of the enforcement roles we wanted them to be in. Or maybe to marry them up with an officer that wasn't involved so that now they have somebody that can kind of watch over them, make sure they're doing okay emotionally.
I think a lot of our first responders really feel more comfortable talking to people who are doing the job. We actually created our own peer support team from the ground up. I think the single biggest lesson learned is to take care of your people, understanding that they've just seen something that they'll never forget.
Washington, D.C., September 16, 2013. A cleared contract employee arrives at Building 197 in the Navy Yard. Passing by security, he proceeds to the 4th floor and removes a sawed-off shotgun from his backpack. Just over a minute later, 911 dispatchers received their first urgent call.
There's a guy shooting people with a shotgun. Please send people quickly. He is killing people.
Just 6 minutes after the first shots are fired, 10 of the 12 victims are already dead. The suspect then encounters his first group of law enforcement officers, and the first of several different gun battles begins.
The suspect escapes after this first exchange, and his demeanor changes from hunter to hunted. Meanwhile, FBI Special Agent David Goldkoff arrives on the scene. A veteran of many active shooter incidents, he finds access roads clogged with fire trucks, police cars, media, and unmarked vehicles.
I had never been faced with a volume of people both responding to and fleeing from an incident in the way they were coming out of the Navy Yard building. There were people dressed in shorts and t-shirts throwing on bulletproof vests with long guns to people dressed in traditional, well-marked law enforcement uniforms stating who they were, what agency they were with, and actually looking more like a traditional police officer.
In all, 117 officers from 10 different agencies entered Building 197 in pursuit of the gunman.
At that point, we were still in the middle of a chaotic situation. All the radio traffic coming out was so conflicting that it was very tough to discern what the subject did or didn't look like. How many subjects were there? How many injuries were there?
We have conflicting reports about the scene.
The fire alarm was going off. It was drowning out the officers' transmissions. It was difficult for them to hear their radio.
So one of the benefits being an incident command with multiple agencies is each agency could talk to their own people, and then we could attempt to deconflict what was going on.
That's negative. I'm going to talk to you on your channel.
The Special Operations Commander from MPD was there. He and I know each other. We were on the trunk of his car, along with representatives from Capitol Police, Federal Protective Services, United States Park Police, NCIS. But we had all worked together for the most part, so when you looked up and saw a friendly face, you didn't have to ask why you were here and what you could offer. You just said, here's what I am doing, and they said, okay, you keep working on that and continue to work the situation from there. It was approximately an hour from the time the first shots were fired until the shooter was actually killed by police, which is one of the longer running active shooter incidents across the country.
After the shooter was down, that's when things got really complicated. We have to stop and sort through these people coming out and determine who has more information, who's a witness, who could potentially be a shooter.
Unified Command struggled to deal with witness management, crime scene processing, victim assistance, and media management.
We had done it all before, and we did it really well in the last crisis, but nobody put it into policy, and there was no protocol.
It was determined at a certain point that the FBI was going to lead the crime scene processing, but it was going to be done jointly with NCIS and MPD as part of those processing teams. Decisions made in Unified Command weren't all that effectively transmitted all the way down to the troops along the way. Working through that challenge of the information flow, it does create some hard feelings initially when there's a lack of understanding of what's going on all parts.
If you don't take those lessons that you learn from every incident immediately and put them in policy or protocol so the people coming behind you know how to do those things or have a roadmap for that, that's not leadership. Every single event we should be improving, and I was so frustrated that we missed that opportunity.
After actions are good tools to use, but an honest after action is a better tool. The beat officers, the guys on the street, are very happy to finish an incident and browbeat each other about what they did wrong and what they did right, and they move forward and learn from it. But getting that message from the officer on the street to the agency head and across agencies can be tough sometimes because we don't want to offend each other. And trying to open those doors and understand that we're all trying to help each other is key to moving forward and learning from these situations.
There's three things I always look for. Where is our policy weak? Where is our training need to be fixed or improved? And what equipment should we have that we didn't have? If you're a command level official in a crisis, I need you to automatically go into that mode. Assign the staging area, set up the traffic perimeter, make sure that you've got a staging area for the news media.
These steps are all critical to stabilizing and managing the scene.
Sorting all that out when you've got an active gunman shooting is very difficult unless you have plans on the shelf. Flexibility in the training is really critical. We had trained under scenarios that were familiar but weren't flexible.
Officers pursuing the shooter understood access would be difficult inside a secure facility.
Those officers really thought on their feet under extraordinary stress.
They used the slain security guard's access card to swipe through locked doors, then prop them open as they went.
So that's the kind of scenarios that we now incorporate into our training. We put small details around in an environment and challenge the officers to use that type of creativity to make sure they get through scenarios safely. 2 of our officers were shot in this incident. We believe because the shooter could hear the radio transmissions. There's no reason for that. I heard another chief give a lecture on an active shooter where he said, "I wish we had earpieces." And I wrote that down when he said it. And then a couple months later, I have this scenario, and all I can think of is why didn't I get those earpieces? Why didn't I go back that day and change the policy and get those earpieces?
Yes, ma'am. Could you please
Missing
hold?
earpieces weren't the only equipment issue that day.
In most jurisdictions, the police and fire are a computer-aided dispatch system, or CAD. And what we didn't know, and we missed, was that inside the walls of the Washington Navy Yard, those streets are not in CAD.
Okay, there is no Isaac Evans Virginia.
Yes, listen to me. Isaac, call. They know where it is. Call the Navy Yard police, please.
Listening to that after, I thought to myself, how many other places in our city, how many college campuses, how many hospital campuses, how many other closed campuses do not have the street names in our computer-aided dispatch system? Those are the kinds of things that you're not going to think of, that's not automatic, and that's why I think it's important for people to look at the after action and look at the unique things that we discovered that are so easily fixable and are so common in so many other jurisdictions.
Two months later, law enforcement would be put to the test again at one of the nation's busiest airports. On the morning of November 1st, 2013, it was just another day at Los Angeles International Airport. When sounds of gunfire were heard in Terminal 3. A 23-year-old male brandishing a rifle opened fire at a security checkpoint before running up an escalator and shooting two other TSA agents and a civilian in the baggage screening area.
Sorry, units respond to Terminal 3 screening. There's a shooter at Terminal 3 screening.
The first officers arrived on the scene within 90 seconds,
Where is he?
pursuing the suspect to the Virgin America gates.
And if you could have one unit respond and stay here.
So their training to respond in an active shooter incident is to respond immediately, form up, and then proceed directly to the suspect. They're not to stop at victims, they're not to stop anywhere, they're to stop the carnage and to stop the threat that the shooter poses.
One officer's cover fire allowed two others to flank the suspect and shoot him.
I think that their superior tactics confused the shooter in our particular case and led to a successful conclusion. It took them 4 minutes and 8 seconds from the time we were notified to the time they were able to neutralize the suspect and take him into custody. So you get 1,000 people that are running to get out of a terminal all at the same time. The vast majority of them fled out onto the airfield.
There were no instructions offered by anyone of any capacity, whether official or not, on safe directions to go.
As officers began clearing hundreds of passengers from the tarmac, they were surprised to find a group of Virgin America employees still hard at work.
I wasn't aware at the time that Virgin America had an operating center within the terminal.
And so when the officers came upon our 24-hour operations center, our local Virgin America operations center, they understandably showed up with intent to simply move everybody out. Well, what they didn't understand is that airlines have to maintain communications with all planes on the ground at any given time.
And they pushed back, indicating that no, they really needed to stay there and to do their particular work. So without my knowledge, an officer took it upon himself to figure out, okay, you make a compelling argument, we'll post somebody here and we'll keep you safe while you operate that piece of it. I'm proud of my officers. They made a lot of decisions that particular day based upon their training and based upon their experience. Some people see chaos, they think things are out of control, and this is not the norm.
This is crazy, dog.
And what I try to teach, and one of the things I stress on a regular basis, is that there is always going to be chaos. In any one of these incidents, you just can't help it. If you don't teach people about chaos, when your first responders show up and there is chaos, they won't know how to react to it. That's what you're going to be judged on later on as to how successful you are, is how quickly you can bring that chaos under control. The fire department had set up their rigs 150 or 200 yards away. I didn't have any representation from the fire department in the command post, and was told initially by a battalion chief through a runner that I had sent down there that they wouldn't be sending anybody to our command post.
When I first arrived on scene, I asked the LAFD chief officer if we were in unified command with LAPD, and he said yes, that we were, but my next question was, where are they? Because one of the tenets of Unified Command is a co-location right next to each other, not 500 to 600, 700 yards.
A chief officer arrived from the fire department shortly thereafter, and we got our representation to the command post. But it created concern on my part because I knew we had injured people in the airport that we had to deal with.
Another key representative to Unified Command was Airport Operations, which manages and maintains 24/7 situational awareness of all aspects of the land and airfield sides of the airport.
We had flights that were international and they were not allowed to deplane into the customs area. We had passengers who were in the terminals that were not allowed to leave. The shooter and catching the suspect was within 4 minutes, which was a great job from the police department. However, we dealt with impacts for 28 hours after that.
Keeping the business open in an airport like LAX is vital. I honestly hadn't really considered how difficult that would be.
A few things we had disagreements on, which is normal, as long as we can have a healthy conversation and a healthy argument. The law enforcement folks were really focused on getting the police vehicles out of the way first before we can open the roadways. They couldn't locate the folks that actually belonged to the cars. Finally, after an argument, I said that it's ridiculous that we continue closing the airport this way because we can't move some vehicles.
And we ultimately had to tow those vehicles to get them out of the way in order to get the airport back up and running. Major parts of the airport were all shot up. The FBI needed to come in with their evidence collection teams and process the crime scene.
There was a different opinion between the public safety folks and the airport operations of saying this is a criminal side, the FBI will never agree, you can't really touch, you're not going to be able to probably see that terminal open for another week. So that's really where I got worried about. I really need to start talking business with them of how many airlines are impacted, how many flights are canceled.
Yaft was also concerned about the 50,000 airport employees and numerous businesses that suffered for every day the airport was closed.
We came up with the idea that we will build a wall between the TSA checkpoint and the ticket counters. If the FBI would allow it, to my surprise, the FBI person didn't see any issue with it. As a matter of fact, said, go for it. I'll help you recover it as fast as possible.
It was actually a very remarkable and ingenious way of keeping the place operating while at the same time making sure that we don't disturb our crime scene and our evidence collection.
And the maintenance folks came in and started doing some repairs to the ticket counters that were broken. All the bullet holes that were in the terminal got repaired.
Just a day after the shooting, Terminal 3 was reopened for business.
We are beginning our boarding process at the time period number 35.
Confirming shots have been fired.
When the officers confronted the suspect in this particular case, they were armed with handguns. He was armed with an MP-15. They were outgunned. We really do need to make sure that our officers have the equipment that they need to address a like threat. In that way, we're committed to ensuring that every single one of our patrol officers are trained in the use of rifles and that we have those rifles available to them as quickly as we possibly can and to forward deploy those rifles in a place where they are accessible to the officers in the event of an emergency. The Brussels attack reminds us that oftentimes the threat's going to come from the public side of the airport. It is going to come from somebody dropping somebody off or somebody pulling up in a vehicle or a van.
Brussels has forced airports to widen their security perimeter, using random security screening of cars, bomb-sniffing dogs, and other measures. So what are the questions that keep Chief Gannon up at night?
How do we continually move forward? How do we adjust to the tactics of terrorists? How do we adjust to the tactics of our own homegrown violent extremists and continually make people feel comfortable that they can come here and fly and that they will be kept safe as we possibly can make them?
All right, what do we got and what do we need to do here?
Training and more training, sets and reps, both from a tactical perspective, an organizational perspective, and a command and control perspective, remains that crucial link to ensure our success or ensure our failure.
First aid training and medical training has become very important in any type of incident now. We've issued every one of our officers triage kits.
If you're in a small jurisdiction, small agency, you don't have the resources, it's probably a good idea to reach out to one of your larger law enforcement partners to get the training anyway, because if you have a scenario, you'll be working that incident together. So training together is the best thing you can do.
What do we got and what do we need to do here?
The partnerships are super important for when an event like this occurs, because I don't care who you are, you're going to need help, and a lot of it.
And actually, since the theater shooting, the city of Aurora has built a joint training facility. So now our police and fire departments actually train in the same facility.
We believe that the shooter went stagnant somewhere on the east end of the building.
The fire department will do amazing things, and they put out amazing fires, and they do amazing rescues on a regular basis. But they are not used to running into incidents that involve people shooting at them. Police officers, conversely, are very nervous about running into a fire and don't want anything to do with a fire. On the other hand, they will run towards gunshots in half a heartbeat.
And so there's a little bit of a conflict there from the cultures of the two agencies.
All right, we'll join in with these guys.
Yep.
Under our policy, members are able to and encouraged to embrace extreme personal risk if the gain is consistent with saving a life.
Ma'am, can you walk?
Yes.
Go down the stairs.
Okay.
That became the impetus for what we now call across the country tactical EMS, where we actually embed both firefighters and police officers in the same functional group.
Got a pulse, he's breathing. Clear.
We create a comfort zone. The firefighters know that we will provide them the protection that they need, and that we will provide them the ability to be able to treat, triage, and then transport victims.
So they're really our force protection. They're going to make sure that we're going into a situation that's safe.
We're moving out.
I'm a big believer that when this novel incident occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning and we get bounced out of bed, that we are not going to rise to the occasion, but we're going to sink to the level of our preparation. Preparation is the only thing we have control over.
Rising mass casualty threats in the U.S. and internationally demand that first responders continually improve their tactical and incident management skills. We must learn from every incident. The highest casualty active shooter incident in American history, the Pulse nightclub shooting, highlights the need for scalable resources. The use of a gun from a checked bag at the Fort Lauderdale International Airport emphasizes the need to anticipate the unexpected.
Active shooters can be anywhere. They can be in movie theaters. They can be in shopping centers. They can be walking down the middle of the street.
Our shooter, no criminal record, no documented mental health history, had never come up on our radar screen.
First responders must work together to adjust tactics and protocols to respond to and manage these incidents, along with the evolving threat of violent extremist groups, and to train, train, train.
And that's what this is all about, is providing that confidence level to our people, that we all feel confident and comfortable that we're going to do the best we can in an incident.
My advice to commanders is that practice component. Practice and do scenarios and tabletops and practice with your partners all the time. That's what saved us that night.
It's one of those things you hope never happens, but you better train for it, because it will happen, and it will happen in places you wouldn't expect. Be ready for it.